But today, we're looking here again in the book of Galatians. Now, last time, we had a really complicated discussion about Abraham in Galatians chapter 3. We won't do more with that. Instead, we go to Galatians chapter 4. Now, the situation Paul has is the same as we had last week. In Galatia, which is this region, we think, we're not exactly sure where it is, and he says this is written to many churches in Galatia. And there is, what has happened is there is a community there that Paul has started of Gentiles. We don't think there were really any Jews in the community. They were Gentiles. And then Paul starts this church, and they come and are part of the community. And it doesn't seem to even be on anybody's radar that they might need to be Jewish to do this. Then Paul leaves. This is what Paul does. He starts a community. He encourages leaders. He finds leaders, and then he moves on to another place. Paul says in the end of Romans, the reason he wants to head out to Spain is because I only like going to where people had never even heard the name Christ before. That's what he likes. And he feels that in this area, everybody's at least familiar with the concept of Christ. So he wants to go west. So that's what Paul does. He goes to these places that have never heard anything about it, about who Jesus is. So that's what Paul did. That was his standard thing. He has a small group. He leaves, and then they're going to go run their church themselves. That's Paul's model. Well, after Paul leaves, some other people show up. We don't know who these people are. Some people just call them the teachers because they don't have names, or very frequently they're called the Judaizers. These people have come in, and they're missionaries, and they've Christian missionaries. They've come in and said, all you Gentiles, we love the fact that you're wanting to follow Jesus, but Jesus was Jewish, and God has always been the God of Israel, so you really do need to become Jewish, and most notably have to be circumcised. Paul hears about this and is writing this letter to say that's wrong. You don't have to do that. So that's kind of the background of Galatians. There's a lot more going on, but that's kind of the big picture. So it's the same thing we had last time. And I hope last time we could appreciate the difficulty with what Paul's doing. Paul is saying two things at once. He is saying, no, you're right. God is only the God of Israel. He believes that. He doesn't say that's over now. It's a little surprising. He could have just said, well, that was then and this is now, and enough with it. But he didn't do that, right? He doesn't say the church has just replaced Israel. Instead, he says, no, that promise God made is real. It's only for Abraham's children. So that would sound like it supports those people who say you have to be circumcised. Well, maybe we don't want to do that, but tough is tough, and that's just the way it goes. But then he also holds a second piece, which says, however, while that first thing is true, also Jesus has changed things. And Gentiles, which is the word Gentile just means anyone who's not Jewish, they can be accepted into relationship with Jesus as Gentiles, and they do not have to become proselyte Jews to do that. So he's saying, yeah, the promises are only for Abraham and his descendants, and you Gentiles who are not his descendants get those promises. That's a hard thing to prove, right? And so Paul's going to do it in a variety of ways in Galatians. Last time we looked at his scriptural argument of the logic of Abraham, saying, well, there's a big difference between a promise given and a covenant, because the promise, when the promise is fulfilled, very frequently only then do we understand what was there the whole time. And his argument was the gospel was originally given to Abraham. Abraham just didn't know, right? That it even said, when it was promised, it even said all the Gentiles will be blessed in you. They don't seem to understand it, in the book of Genesis, but that's what he says. It was there the whole time, and now we can see it, right? And it's a whole logic he's going to argue in Galatians chapter 3, and it's confusing, it's complex. So I apologize if we got a little lost last time. This will be a little bit more concrete. And remember the question: how can these Gentiles be part of the family of Abraham if they weren't born into it? It doesn't sound like something you can just choose to do, right? So here we are in Galatians chapter 4. So what I want to do is actually read, we're going to look at verses 1 to 11 today. That's all we'll look at. And I want to read we'll just start from the beginning, and we're going to break this down. But what I want to do is actually, I'm going to read the first 7 verses. So this is Galatians chapter 4, verses 1 to 7. Here's what he says. My point is this: heirs, as long as they are minors, are no better than slaves, though they're the owners of all the property. But they remain under guardians and trustees until the date set by the father. So with us. While we were minors, we were enslaved to the elemental spirits of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order to redeem those who were under the law, so we might receive adoption as children. And because you are children, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a child. And if a child, then also an heir through God. A lot's going on in that little section. We'll kind of break it down, but just any questions or things that stuck out to you thinking about that question that Paul's trying to prove? Any thoughts? Well, real basically here, right, we have the problem was God said it's only the family of Abraham who will be in relationship with us. These other teachers, these Judaizers said, well, if that's the case, then you've got to be really in the family of Abraham. Paul responds, well, wait a minute, let's think about families. There's a few ways you can be included in a family. One is through birth, but also there is this thing called adoption. And you see what he's going to do here with this adoption language. And so he said, let's explore that idea. And this is going to govern the whole conversation here. And also, by the way, if you read the book of Ephesians, this is really emphasized also in the book of Ephesians, why couldn't it be that Gentiles are adopted, right? That's what he wants to say going through this. And then he's going to kind of think back logically. Well, is it really, bad? Is that a problem for people to be adopted? Is there something happening that would make that make sense? And he's going to argue, yeah, absolutely. That'll make it make sense. But this is what Paul wants to say. Adoption is another way people could be part of this family. And what Paul believes, the end of days has come, and there is new flexibility in how you're part of the people of Israel. Okay. Any questions or thoughts about this?
Ben, I had to take my car in this morning, so I have no idea where you are.
So we're on Galatians 4, verses 1 to 7.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
And we're just getting started talking about Paul's new metaphor for trying to understand how our Gentiles, or maybe all people, related to God, maybe it's through adoption. And what I want to think about here is cause us to think about a little bit, what is the value of because these are all metaphors for trying to understand how we are part of the people of God. What's the value of the metaphor of adoption? What comes along in your mind? What do you think about when you think about being adopted into the family of God?
Well, Jesus is adopted, for starters.
Okay, this is, we're going to, it might even be in 2 weeks, we're going to look at Matthew 1. There's a real problem with the genealogy of Jesus. It goes all this way to show Abraham and Jesus are related, but there's a big problem with it. It ends with, and then it ends with Joseph. Well, Joseph's not Jesus's father, so how does that have anything to do with it, right? So Jesus has to be included in here some way. So surely there's a partnering there. And Paul's little language of him being born of a woman and so forth, maybe he's kind of thinking about that there in verse 4. It's a good point. Any other thoughts about this adoption thing?
One of my questions would be that in the Old Testament, there's a process of grafting, taking a tribe, especially having to do with Moses and, a group of this people getting grafted onto the trunk of Israel. Is the adoption you're talking about an adoption into the chosen people or an adoption that goes directly to God?
This is a good question, and it's something scholars debate. It goes back to the verse. If we go back to verse 1, he's going to set up this dichotomy: the people in a household who are family and those who are servants or slaves, right? And he clearly is talking to his group. We identify more with the group who are not family. Well, does that mean the ones who are family, does that mean that it's the Jews are the ones who are family and the Gentiles were the ones who were slaves? Or is it everybody? Is, and that scholars debate it. But what becomes the case is one thing you'll find is if you look through the Old Testament, one word that never shows up is adoption. It's not a concept. There's things that happen that are sort of like it in the Old Testament, but the actual thing is a very Roman thing. It happened in Greece too, but it was a very Roman concept of adoption. I think Paul, in my view, it's both. It both is you are part of the Israel of God, which will be his word in chapter 6 for this new community, and that does include regular, what was and it has always been Israel, and incorporated also the Gentiles, but it's a direct relationship with God, and we're going to see that later on. The Spirit is what is shouting, Abba, Father, right? So Pastor Mike, that's my answer. It's actually kind of both, but that's a key thing. But just a little bit more about adoption. Think about the difference between what it would mean for the people of Israel to be, by birth rather than adoption. There's one really big difference. Well, I'll just say what I'm thinking here, but which is that God deliberately chooses those who are adopted. There's a really big difference between that and just this idea of genealogical, things. Now, genealogy is more chosen than we usually give it credit for, but that's a different story. Paul wants that idea. There is a deliberate action by God that interrupts what would have been just seemingly the natural flow of things, right? Something new has happened. God's action is doing something. Here. Terry, you just joined us. We're on Galatians chapter 4, verses 1 to 7. That's kind of some of the big picture. And then Paul's going to do two things. He's going to say, one, all of us as Gentiles are adopted as sons and daughters into the family of God. And two, he wants to say, and it's no worse than being born into the family. That's a really important point for him, because that's what he sees as the end of this. If you just let it go, it's not that it's going to make every last Gentile is now going to have to become a proselyte Jew. No, it's going to make a division, and there's going to be the real or the better Christians, those who follow the Torah, and those lesser ones who are just kind of trying. He is not going to stand for that. Paul is not, and he sees that as the end of this. In chapter 5, and he says, if you are nipping and biting at one another, don't you see how you'll devour each other? And in fact, all the ethical discussions he has in Galatians chapter 5, they look like really boring lists of what are the vices and what are the virtues. But actually, if you look at them, almost all of them are about community. How do you live and treat one another in them? And in fact, there were kind of standard lists you can find about virtues and vices. Paul has deliberately added community ones. How do you relate with each other? You can take a look at that yourself. That's what he thinks is going to happen if you guys have this divided community between the Jews and the Gentiles. So he's got to show there isn't a big difference between this. In fact, you are all one. Now, there's one thing about adoption in Rome that is maybe different from adoption now. I don't know as much about now. In Rome, there was no distinction between a born child and an adopted child. And very frequently, if someone was adopted, if you look in Greek and Roman sources, it wouldn't say they were adopted. Like, it doesn't, there truly is no difference. And that, I think, is the ideal situation now, but it's, maybe we often give that caveat, but in Rome it just wasn't the case. And so that's what we have here. So what Paul says is the point is going to structure this as we move forward. So first he starts with verse 1. So let's just work through this slowly. So chapter 4, verse 1 says, my point is this: heirs, those who are going to receive the property, heirs, as long as they are minors, are no better slaves, though they're the owners of all the property. Okay, just real quickly, what is his point there?
Well, if you haven't come into full understanding or into some vision of adulthood, then it doesn't really matter who you are and where you are. Yeah,
a lot of the point has to do with, okay, so he's talking here in terms of inheritance. Being an heir of an estate, his point is it doesn't help you very much. What you need is the inheritance, right? To be promised something in the future. Well, you haven't received anything now, right? And here he gives a further example of when they're a minor. Even if the parents have died, right? And that's kind of what this is a metaphor. So this is kind of what you have to assume is going on, where it says, an heir, as long as the heir is still a minor, well, that minor has received nothing more than slaves in the household, people who have absolutely nothing, right? No one's received anything. That's what he wants to say from the start. And his point is nobody's received anything yet. However, if you're part of Israel, if you're not part of Israel, nobody's received anything. Then he says here in verse 2, why not? But they remain under guardians and trustees until the date set by the father. So this is that same point, saying there's no difference in all of humanity right now, or, well, not quite right now, beforehand, before Jesus arrives, because nobody's received an inheritance. And that is a really key point that he makes in Galatians 3, when he said Abraham received kind of like a will. He didn't receive an estate. He only got the promise of an estate, right? Nobody's gotten it yet. We're in the waiting period. He says that's what he said. Everybody's equally without a state right now.
Hey, Ben?
Yeah, please.
So, I'm kind of wondering as I look at that sentence too, could it be the fact that they're not worthy of it yet? just looking at the sentence, wondering, as long as they are minors, they're no better than slaves until their father said so, and wondering if he's making a comment that they're not worthy of receiving that inheritance yet. Just a question.
Yeah, and that would fit really well with chapter 3, when he says, you know, the law bound up all things. That's the word, all things, not just all people, all things under sin, in order that the fullness of time could come, right? You were put into this place where everybody's set up in that situation together. And I think there's something about that with minors. You know, says the law acted as a child carer, a teacher of children. It's called a pedagogue. This is in chapter 3, where he says that there might be something there to that. And I do think we're talking about the question of worth in Paul, which I think is definitely an important question. You know, is that's what he's saying. When you're minors, you know, there's something that needs to happen before you're ready to receive this. I think that's part of it. You know, so I think it's a good point, Trey. Any other questions or thoughts about this?
How does this, I'm reading just beyond that, and where he talks about being under the law and with the law. Is there a parallel here with Romans and the whole heirs and co-heirs with Christ? Because then that would, if he's using the same kind of language, does that shift the emphasis? Because then all of a sudden you are an heir from God, not from the Abrahamic promise, but directly from God. And especially if we become co-heirs with Christ, that changes our status. Is there a tie here, or am I leaping too far?
I'm always both and with this, because I think Paul is both and, because I think you're right. But you know, I always go back to that, how we started last time, the distinction, the movement from Galatians 3:28 to 3:29, which is there is no more Jew and Gentile, right? You're all one in Christ. And it's also true that if you're in Christ, you're now a son of Abraham, right? Or the seed of Abraham. Like both things have to be true for Paul all the time. So I think that kind of is the case. But it's an interesting thought about pairing it with Romans. Because here, the adoption metaphor, very clear. The adoption metaphor eventually breaks down, right? And we have to be very clear about that. And I think that there's a good point there. But let's go a little bit farther here and see if we can kind of puzzle out what he's doing. So it says in verse 3 and following. So with us, while we were minors, we were enslaved to the elemental spirits of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order to redeem those who were under law, so that we might receive adoption as children. Let's just pause there. The key moment here, there's a whole thing about enslaved to these elemental spirits of the universe, which is a whole thing that I don't want to go too far into right now. But what it says is the fullness of time has come. This is a very important thing for Paul. That which was, you were minors before until that set date, what did he just say? It happened. The date has come, right? The time has come to fruition. And that's when Jesus arrives. And now the rules have changed. And yeah, I think Pastor Mike, it looks like he's not there, but is now we're going to have a direct relationship with God. And we're going to see that here in verse 6, especially. Now, I do think it still has to do with Israel, but it is this interesting the way that he's almost moving beyond Israel in many ways. So he says that fullness of time had to come. One is when things came to maturity, right? You're no longer minors anymore. Then things changed drastically. He said two things happened. One, he was going to redeem those who were under the law so that we, and here he's using the we to include the Gentiles and Paul, interestingly, to say, we're now going to receive adoption. The original thing was, remember, in any household, there's a lot of people, and there's some people who were heirs expecting to receive an estate, and slaves not expecting to receive an estate. And then he says, so that we might receive adoption as children. He says, at that moment, there is new flexibility when Jesus comes and the rules have been changed. That things are going to shift. And I think he uses this adoption language for the both and. Look at the way you could still be part of the larger family of God, which, yes, includes the family of Abraham, but is you're not really adopted by Abraham. It doesn't say that. You're adopted seemingly by God. And this is where the metaphor breaks down, right? Because usually you don't receive the inheritance until the father is dead. Well, if God's a father, that's a problem, right? The metaphor is broken down here. It only goes so far, right? But this idea that, who's doing the adopting? Well, it's not Abraham, right? It's God. And that, I think, it speaks kind of to Pastor Mike's point. Okay, any questions or thoughts about this?
Well, I know you didn't want to say too much about the elemental spirits, but I wanted to ask a question about that because it appears again down in 9, 10, or 11 down there, beggarly spirits. And so in addition to the inheritance metaphor, which does break down, there's a liberation metaphor going on, which is for all people. So that's the uniting thing. It's not a moral thing. It's not something that we did. It's not about our virtues. It's about, as it says earlier, about God's grace. When the fullness of time had come, God sent God's Son. And that's a liberation metaphor, which I don't think breaks down. And I think it has more valence today than the inheritance, which is kind of a postponement. So I know you didn't want to say too much about the elemental spirits, but I was just on another podcast and it was a shaman talking about entering the spirit world. And I thought, oh, here we go. So
yeah, well, we do want to talk about it. I was going to save it for verse 8, but you're absolutely right, Terry, that there is a very liberating moment in Paul's gospel. That is a fundamental component of Paul's gospel, is freedom from what he calls later, these things that were not God's. and that you didn't know, right? You're going to make that very clear later on. The word elemental spirits of the universe, this is almost an untranslatable phrase. I usually just leave it, they're called stoicheia, is the word in Greek if you're interested. And it means, the actual root word just means like elements, like the periodic table of elements. And of course, they thought there were 4. And they thought those things, now this is going to get real complicated, so just go with me for a second. Those things were basically eternal, and anything that's eternal had to be divine somehow, and thought they had powers. And so in Greek and Roman religion, it actually was very common for people to feel they had to appease these lower powers before they could get beyond their control. Right? And that was what people would have heard when he's using this word, these spirits of the universe kind of thing. It's a odd, confusing phrase. And we could, the book of Colossians addresses this, the book of Ephesians addresses this, because in Colossae, people are still worshiping these things. And Paul's whole point is, you don't have to do all this anymore. But he's saying it, but Paul interestingly says, and this is an important point for Paul, there are real enslaving powers in this world. There are big forces beyond any individual thing. A big error that I think in the Western view of Scripture and Paul is that we've made everything so individual. Paul didn't think individually that way. He's thinking of bigger problems, right? And notice his point. We're all adopted as sons and daughters, right? We're all adopted as children, right? It's a collective thing rather than an individual thing, because he's dealing with big problems. Yeah, Terry, please.
Well, yeah, in response to that, we just passed a resolution at the Oregon Synod about reparations, about racism, and kind of going back and trying to make amends is the language that I would use. And it seems like that's an elemental spirit that kept us in bondage, both black and white, and is, you know, potentially liberated here. But, you know, how does that then get embedded in, you know, not just the spiritual world, but in the real world? So that's when I read elemental spirits, I immediately thought about racism, and he does use the image of slavery here a lot too. And it's a very contemporary issue right now.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I'd have to think about it some more. I attended the Oregon Synod as a tech support person, so I got to see that conversation. But yeah, that's an interesting point. You know, but the idea of larger systemic evil that's bigger than any one person, but it's also including people, is kind of what we're dealing with here. That is one of Paul's points. Okay, let's move to verse 6, because this is going to be a really key thing, right? He says, these all needed to happen could receive adoption. Then verse 7, and this is critical, or excuse me, verse 6. Then verse 6. And because you are children, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Notice what's happened for this adoption language.
Yeah, it looks like we've changed the word from minors to child and children. So no longer property.
Yeah, and it is a different word too. It's in the Greek, it's changed deliberately to be where, you know, that fullness of time came. You're all adults now, right? And what Paul's going to argue is exactly at the time that inheritance came, everything shifted. It all happened at once, right? In one big motion. And so, yeah, that I think is very much a good point here. And that's what is verse 7. He says, and so you are no longer a slave, right? But a child. And if a child, then you're an heir, but through God, which was Pastor Mike's point earlier, right? So this is a key element. First, yeah, we've absolutely moved to the children language. Good. Other things that strike you about this adoption thing?
There is a, you know, the Abba Father is a plea for help. You know, I mean, it's not just a prayer. And it has two exclamation points. You know, in the sense that this is Abba. And so out of all the other stuff that he's just raised about being righteous, not being righteous, and all that stuff, God is going to listen to your cry. You know, and that to me is an important part of this. It's not just that you've been adopted and you're now heirs and you're now children, but God's going to listen to you. And that's a big deal.
Yeah. And this is where
Jesus does on the cross.
This is where the adoption language has to break down a little bit for us to understand what's happening. There's different ways to become heirs, right? And one of them, and in fact, the more common thing in the Roman world, the reason someone would be adopted is because someone was dying and had no heirs. So they would pick a particular person to adopt so that my line will continue. Probably most famously is Julius Caesar adopts Octavian to be Caesar Augustus. But here, and so it could be a very, you know, transactional thing. and there'd be almost no, here, no, the point of saying that, because this would not be something normally said, is it's a relationship. There's a relationship that's set up. It's not just a transfer of, well, now I got the property after all. Well, yeah, this is where that breaks down, right? It's not just about receiving property, right? And the key point for me also is it says, God sent the Spirit into our hearts, shouting, Abba, Father. Note who is doing the work, right? This is God's action. And what is God's action internally in us? A relationship with God, right? There's a relationship with God itself being driven by God to create a sustaining relationship that, as Pastor Mike rightly says, God hears. God hears now. You have a real relationship together. This is this idea of this, you've shifted. If you're using the household metaphor, you're not just slaves in the household who, are treated inhumanly and so on. No, you're fully members who have a full relationship with absolutely the wholeness of what it means to be children. So this is the key element here, what he's describing. And that's how he gets to his conclusion. So you're no longer a slave, but you're a child. And if a child, then you're an heir. Remember, that was his whole point to start with, right? How can these people who are not heirs be heirs? Said, look at the action of God. And it all happened because at the fullness of time, right when you thought that we knew who was who and who was going to be receiving the estate, everything is thrown out and things are kind of changed. But now you're a different kind of an heir, one through God. And this is a key point. Remember, his whole point was that, well, are these Gentiles going to be seen as like less than the Jews, right? Which is part of what happened. If someone in the first century and decided they wanted to become Jewish, right? It's called go through the proselyte process and become Jewish. They could, most of the time they could, but they'd always be seen as like the second tier community member. And that's Paul's point. It's like, no, you're not a second tier person. This is through God. Why are you worried about being a son through Abraham? Be a child through God. That's better, right? His point of this, there is no division in the house here, right? This is completely together. Okay, any thoughts or reflections on this?
I have a question that might be a bit esoteric, but as I was looking at, I guess this is still verse 6, and the idea of God sending the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the first thing that struck me, or one of the early things that struck me, was that it's into our hearts and not into our mind. And we talk so much in the 21st century about head and heart, or intellectual and kind of felt or embodied, but I'm also aware that that's our understanding, and I'm curious what the understanding of somebody in Paul's time would have been about that, because I mean, obviously the ancient Egyptians didn't believe the brain did anything. They, pulled it out and got rid of it when they embalmed people. So what Paul is a Jewish Roman person, like, would they have had that mind-heart conception, or would they really have seated all of consciousness in the heart? Because I'm conscious of the way that we can transpose our own mindset upon the text in problematic ways.
Yeah. This is there's sort of a debate, because you have to start looking at, depends what you do. If you think Paul was really, really influenced by Plato, then the mind really matters. The nous was what it was called, right? That really matters. But I don't particularly think Paul was very influenced by Plato, but there are some people who do. So I should at least give that as a background. But in Judaism, that is almost not there. What does matter a lot is the heart and the spirit. The spirit is probably the most important thing, which you can see is all the way through here. And actually some Greek Roman philosophy too, like Stoicism, everything was about the pneumatic, the spirit. They didn't use the word spirit and mean what we mean by spirit, but they still had that same structure of what's the really real inside of you. They'd use language of souls, they'd use language of spirit, and use language of body and heart. And for Paul, I think it's the reason he likes heart, and the reason the Old Testament does, it wants to emphasize the embodiment of it, the very realness of it in the whole body right now. You know, I mean, that is like, for example, Paul really thinks about, he says, it's the revelation of God in me, right? Not to me, but in me, right? Or the, if you look, we won't look at it here together, but if you look at chapter 4 of Galatians, verse 12 to 20, it's all about the way Paul's body is the expression of his gospel. What we're going to find, if you read all of Paul, Paul believes he is his gospel. And it's because it happens in their whole being, your whole body. And I don't think that's different now. I think, you know, I think it, and there is like good sociological work is trying to emphasize that. There was a recent book by one of my teachers at UW, Jim Wellman. Oh, you might have remember he moderated that conversation on megachurch movements and so forth. And that's his whole point, is that it's a fully embodied experience that people are having. It's not just a, you know, argue your right position and come to the right understanding. It's fully experiential. And I think Paul's right there with that. So that's my quick answer. I don't think Paul thinks a lot about the news. Now, he does talk about the renewing of your minds. I mean, that happens, you know, so it's not ever completely separated, but it's not the same kind of distinction we have, is the way I would put it. What I don't know is the ancient medicine side of exactly how they viewed like the brain. And so I'm not aware, but I'd be very interested. Good. Any other thoughts or questions about this?
Let's see, where was I? It isn't until, I mean, it says that this God sent his son, born of a woman, to redeem those under the law. And then because you are sons, God sent the spirit of his son. So because Jesus came, then God sent the spirit, and that spirit within us cries out for the relationship with God when it says Abba, Father. Anyway.
That is exactly the point. You're exactly right to point this out. This is why I think, you know, Luther really was onto the right thing, where he says, faith is a gift given to us, right? It's God's action is doing that. And then it has real effect in our lives, of course. But that's exactly and this is two things. It's the two things happening at once. What made the fullness of time come? God sending his son. And what did God sending his son do? That's what set the spirit into our hearts doing this thing. It's all tied in one move for Paul. This is why when you read through Paul, everything is tied in crucifixion, resurrection. In Galatians, it's all about crucifixion. In fact, resurrection only comes up in verse 1. That's it. But if you read other things, it's all about, you know, in Ephesians, you have this in resurrection. But it's because it's all in that one moment, that how all of this action is occurring. Great point. Any other thoughts about this? All right. I want to just give a little moment to verses 8 to 11, because it grounds us back into Galatians a little bit, right? Paul's not trying to make an abstract argument, you know, it's supposed to be a very specific one to what's happening. So just, this is the part that I think as Terry was pointing out before, it has some real contemporary pieces to it, but it was really meant to a very specific thing to the community there. And we'll think about how maybe we could apply that. So I'm just going to read verses 8 to 11 here. So it's chapter 4, 8 to 11. Formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to beings that by nature are not gods. And by the way, that's the same word as the fundamental spirits of the universe. Now, however, that you have come to know God, or rather, to be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and beggarly elemental spirits? How can you want to be enslaved to them again? You are observing special days and months and seasons and years. I'm afraid that my work for you may have been wasted. Paul's kind of pessimistic throughout Galatians and angry, but what does strike you about what he's saying here?
One thing that strikes me is that he almost corrects himself in verse 9, that you've come to know God, or rather to be known by God. Then to go back would be the conscious choice piece. And to stay in God is the acceptance piece.
Yeah, really good point. Really good point. This is what he's saying. And I think that's why he's saying, like, to be known by God. There is something really powerful at work. And you want to go back to this other stuff. Like, why would you do that? Right? And what he's saying is you're acting as if the fullness of time hadn't come. You're acting as if these things had occurred simply in vain. That's what he says in the beginning of chapter 3. Did you receive the Spirit in vain? Right? Did you experience these things in vain? Right? He's bewildered by this group. Why would you do this? Right? He's also being very sarcastic here in another way. He says, you're returning to when you worship those things that weren't God. Well, almost certainly the community there were, if they were anything, practitioners of Roman religion. And now they're not going back and doing Roman religion. They're starting to try to adopt, Jewish customs, right? Jewish Torah law and so forth. Well, Paul's insulting them, right? This is what he says in verse 10. You're observing special days and months and seasons and years. If you know anything about Roman religion, that's everything about Roman religions are festivals. In fact, the only reason they had calendar was for these festivals. And that's actually how it was structured. They didn't think of their calendars as they didn't have it like we did with a big chart with 1, 2, 3, 4. It would always be how many days from the first of the month, how many days before the Ides, or after or before, because that's all that mattered. We wanted to make sure we were doing our religious festivals, and they constantly were doing religious festivals. So when they heard that, what is Paul saying? You going and adopting all this practice is the same as if you just gone back to the temple of Jupiter again, right? I mean, he's not being polite here, because that's not what they're doing, but he's saying you're effectively doing that. That is acting as if the fullness of time hasn't come, as if the Spirit hasn't entered to your heart, as if you weren't known by God. There is something bigger happening that's going on here. Yeah, please.
And do you think all this, I don't know, did Paul actually met these people in Galatia? He was there at one time and then left. So is this just a letter to them, or is he actually there seeing what these other teachers are bringing in and how that's affecting the Galatians?
Yeah, so he's writing a letter. He's not there at the time.
Okay.
Normally with his letters, he says, I want to come visit you now, but I can't because I'm too far away. But that my letters are acting as like a substitute for my presence. And he does say, I wish I were among you, because if I were, my tone would change. He says that in verse 20, chapter 4, verse 20. but
Oh, yeah.
you know, he has heard what's happening. Now, we don't know how he's heard this. Sometimes he tells us that he's heard about it. Like in 1 Corinthians, he actually receives a letter from them, and then the people delivering it give him a kind of tell him what's going on. Here, we don't know how he knows. But he's upset, and he's really upset, and he is going to write. But what he does say is that there's a really, it doesn't seem like a lot of things, but in chapter 6, verse 11, he says, notice I'm writing with my handwriting now. And that was actually a really big thing. Normally, he probably wasn't very good at writing. Most people weren't. We often think of those skills together, reading and writing is the same thing. But in antiquity, a lot of people could read, but they couldn't write very well, like, you know, actually pen very well. So he would have someone who would do that for him, and he'd dictate. At the end, he writes himself, and I'm going to write the whole thing. Why? Well, because so they know I'm really behind this. This is really me here, right? You know, and he does think of his letters as a substitute for his personal presence.
So he knows that these teachers have come among them and are stirring this up, right? Okay. Yeah. So they really need a shepherd in their midst, is what he's trying to tell them with this letter.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And actually, if we were to continue reading it, verse 12 to 20, he has this view. If I were there, things would be different. And I don't think he means it needs to be me. He wants somebody else to have that role, right? One of you needs to be the Paul in this community, someone who's going to embody the gospel and who will be leading this community. I think he really thinks this community, they're not lost, right? That without much effort, you would come around to this. We just need that opportunity. And that's what I think, the way I think Paul thinks about this. It's very different. Like even he has a major conflict with Peter in chapter 2, and he says, you are acting like a hypocrite, which in Greek actually means more like a pretender. He doesn't say you're a heretic or you're an apostate. He says, no, you're just not acting rightly, right? You actually know, you're just not realizing what you know. And I think that might be how he views the community, being generous. But he is upset with them. I mean, he is just really upset. Other thoughts or questions about this? Well, as a final word, I hope you appreciate Paul's use of the metaphor of adoption. It looks like someone was saying something. No. Okay. Maybe I was hearing my own feedback there. But that Paul is, I hope you appreciate this rhetoric of adoption. Paul's making a hard argument. It's one that's hard for us to recognize as hard, because for us, the idea that it would even be, you know, a question that Gentiles would be Christians as Gentiles is, you know, for us, Jewish Christianity is a tiny, tiny portion of Christianity. When Paul's alive, it's the opposite. He's the outlier. You know, there was logical argument to be made that it seemed like it would make sense that Gentiles would have to become Jewish. And so he's got a tough case to make. And he's going to do it in a variety of ways. And there's a lot going on, and a reason he doesn't just say, all that's over, don't worry about it anymore. What Paul really wants is he wants to say, there is a lot of room for variety and unity. And those two things aren't enemies of each other. Their intention, of course, their intention, but they're tied together. And there's, I get too far afield on this. This is my area that I'm really working on right now. But he really wants to make the case apocalyptically in a relationship with Christ. There's no half being in Christ. You're all in Christ. We're all one in Christ. but then there's major variation for what that looks like in any community, with any people, and how you're going to live together, right? Like he says, you know, the distinction, Jew and Gentile, are all one in Christ. He doesn't, though, say they're all the same in Christ, right? That is, all these things are gone now. And in like the 3rd century and forward, you know, people started to do this, saying, you know, there's like Christians were like a race of people. Like, you're not a Jew or a Greek, you're a new thing, a Christian. There's even a book called Why This New Race, which was a judge asked in the 4th century, what is this thing? You guys seem to have made up a nation, you know, kind of thing. And there were people who did that. I don't think Paul does that. Paul doesn't want such a nice, easy package to put everything in. He says, no, it's messy. And these have diverse communities, and it's going to create tensions and challenges. And that's part of it, right? That's part of the challenge of what it is to be embracing what he called the scandal of the cross. So, okay, there's a lot more to that. But okay, any final questions or thoughts here? All right, Pastor Mike, do we have any announcements? And then would you close in prayer when you're through with those?
Yeah, just a reminder of High Tea and Happy Hour tomorrow. We're going to kind of debrief both the election and the reaction, and just talk about how that's impacting our lives and our nation. We're going to be, let's see, Advent and Christmas is coming up. We're going to be actually doing a lot of taping and stuff early. So if people want to participate in various activities and help with things, please let us know. Troy and Todd were meeting yesterday, and that was, they're doing good work. So let's see. Council stuff is coming up. If you haven't turned in your gift planning sheet that was mailed to you last month, it would be really helpful for you to return that. It just really makes our job easier to do the kind of planning that we want to do. So think about that. Other than that, I don't think we have anything else at this time. So the Lord be with you.
No.
Holy God, we give you thanks and praise for your word. It both gives us comfort and it gives us challenge, which the word is supposed to do. Open our hearts to hear what is being said here by Paul about we're not just one thing, we are many things. And both the diversity of our country, our communities, our families, help us pay attention to that as we live into what it means to be a welcoming and inclusive church. And we ask Christ to guide us in that work ahead. Amen. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.